200 beings, one mountain, one oath, and a decision that changed the trajectory of every human life that followed. Most people who open their Bibles never encounter this story, not because it isn't there, but because the layers that lead to it were carefully, systematically buried over centuries. The book of 1st Enoch was not lost by accident. It was read by the earliest followers of Jesus. It was quoted by Jude, referenced by Peter, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon for over 2,000 years. And yet somewhere along the way it was removed from the conversation, quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. Today we are bringing it back, and here is what I need you to hold on to as we go deeper. This is not an isolated story. Every thread we are about to follow, the Watchers, the mountain, the oath, the offspring, leads somewhere specific. It leads to a revelation embedded in the New Testament itself, hiding in plain sight in a passage most believers read and move past without realizing what they are standing in front of. By the time we arrive there, you will understand exactly why this knowledge was concealed and why recovering it reshapes everything. Stay with us until the very end, because what waits there is not what you expect. The book of 1st Enoch, chapter 6, does not ease you into the story. The ancient Aramaic manuscript tradition, one of the oldest surviving textual records, opens with a council, not a gradual drift, not a single being acting alone in a moment of weakness. A gathering, a deliberation, a collective decision made by beings the ancient world identified with a title whose original language has been almost entirely lost in translation. The Hebrew and Aramaic root behind their name carries the meaning of those who do not sleep. Beings of sustained, unwavering consciousness. Presences of awareness operating at a scale the human mind was never designed to fully comprehend. The original language reveals something startling here. When we examine the root structure of the term used to identify them, we are not reading a generic label for angelic beings. We are reading a job description. These were designated observers, assigned, positioned, entrusted. The weight of that word implies accountability. It implies that they knew exactly what their post was, exactly what it demanded, and exactly what it would cost to abandon it. Pause and consider the implications of that. When we read about Adam and Eve, we are reading about human beings deceived, creatures who did not fully grasp the weight of what they were stepping into. The serpent obscured, the fruit concealed its consequence. There was confusion, manipulation, a layering of deception that in some measure explains, though does not excuse, what happened. The Watchers had none of that cover. They saw, they understood. They gathered in full consciousness of what they were choosing, and their leader, a figure named Semyaza, speaks words in the text that should stop every listener cold. He says, "I fear that you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin." Read that again slowly. He was not afraid of judgment. He was not wrestling with doubt about whether this was wrong. He was afraid of being the only one. So they did something that the text records with chilling precision. They bound themselves together with a mutual oath, each one swearing that if any other broke ranks, the guilt of the entire covenant would fall on the one who refused. 200 beings, one oath, one mountain, and the text records no hesitation, no dissenting voice, not one among them who pulled back at the threshold. This was not a stumble. This was a coordinated act of collective rebellion. Hidden beneath the surface of that detail is something that changes how we understand the nature of spiritual warfare itself. The pieces begin to align when we understand that this event was not random. The mountain they chose, Mount Hermon, rising to nearly 9,300 feet at the northern boundary of ancient Israel, its peak perpetually veiled in cloud, was not chosen by accident either. Embedded in its very name is the Hebrew word cherem, a term the ancient Israelites understood immediately. It meant something set apart under a curse, something devoted to destruction. The name of the mountain where the pact was sealed already carried within it the verdict of what was done there. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern that most modern readers walk right past, that across the ancient Near East, mountains functioned as cosmic meeting points, the place where heaven pressed against earth, where the boundary between realms became permeable. The Watchers did not descend just anywhere. They descended at the precise location where the threshold between the seen and unseen world was thinnest. And what they did there, what they set in motion on that mountain with that oath, would force God's hand in a way the world had never witnessed before or since. But before we open that dimension of the story, before we follow the chain of consequence that flows from that single night on Mount Hermon, we need to sit with a question the text places directly in front of us. Who were these beings before they descended? What was their rank in the heavenly order? What exactly did they abandon when they sealed that oath? Because when you see what they gave up, what they were designed to be before desire displaced calling, their choice becomes not simply shocking, it becomes almost incomprehensible. Before the oath, before the descent, before Mount Hermon became the site of the most consequential act of collective rebellion in the ancient world, there was an assignment. And understanding that assignment changes everything about how we read what came after. Most discussions of the Watchers begin at the moment of their fall. That is a mistake, because the weight of what they chose cannot be felt unless we first understand what they were before they chose it. The text is not simply telling us the story of beings who failed, it is showing us the tragedy of a calling abandoned, and there is a difference between those two things that cuts all the way to the bone. The Hebrew and Aramaic traditions assign the Watchers a specific place in the heavenly hierarchy, not as peripheral figures, not as minor attendants, but as a distinct class of beings occupying a position of considerable trust and proximity. The ancient book of Daniel, chapter 4, uses the same term, ear, the Watchers, in a context that reveals something startling about their function. In that passage, a Watcher descends with a decree. His word carries the weight of divine verdict. He does not suggest, he does not petition, he announces. The literary structure itself reveals what most readers step over entirely. This is not the language of a messenger, this is the language of a custodian, a designated guardian of order, someone entrusted not merely to observe from a distance, but to maintain the integrity of what God had established. Consider the implications of that for a moment. The ancient scholar Enoch, writing within a tradition that Second Temple Judaism took with profound seriousness, describes the Watchers as beings stationed between the throne room of heaven and the unfolding story of humanity. Think of it not as a passive role, but as an active commission. They were positioned at the intersection of realms, present enough to the human story to understand it, elevated enough in their nature to transcend it. That combination of closeness and transcendence was not accidental. It was the precise design of their calling. Some scholars have argued that the Watchers represent simply another term for fallen angels, that their story is merely a retelling of Satan's rebellion dressed in different clothing. Others propose that the Enochian tradition invented them wholesale as a theological device to explain human evil, without implicating God in its origins. But when we examine the evidence, neither of those readings survives contact with the original language. Hidden beneath the surface of the textual tradition is a distinction that most translations flatten entirely. The rebellion described in the Enochian corpus is not the same event as the fall of Satan. The two traditions run parallel, yes, but they are not identical. The Watchers are not depicted as beings who rebelled against God's sovereignty in a cosmic power struggle. Their rebellion was of an entirely different nature. It was not about throne, it was about desire. The original language reveals something startling in the verb used to describe what the Watchers did when they looked at the daughters of men. It is not a word that implies momentary attraction. It is a word that implies a sustained gaze, a deliberate dwelling of attention that over time became a consuming orientation of will. They did not fall in a moment of weakness. They fell through the slow accumulation of a longing they chose not to resist. The pieces begin to align when we understand what that distinction means theologically. These were beings who had stood in the presence of God. Beings whose consciousness operated at a level of clarity and comprehension that no human being this side of eternity has ever accessed. They could not claim ignorance. They could not claim deception. When desire arose in them, they recognized it for what it was, and they chose to follow it anyway. Pause and consider what kind of courage, or what kind of catastrophic pride that requires. The ancient parallel is precise and devastating. The soldier metaphor breaks open the full weight of it. Imagine a soldier, not a raw recruit, but a decorated veteran. someone who has served at the highest post, who has been trusted with the most sensitive commission, who carries within himself the full history of his service and the full knowledge of what his oath demands. Now imagine that soldier, not confused, not deceived, not coerced, but simply wanting something on the other side of the line, and choosing it. That is the Watcher story. And here is what most teaching on this subject quietly sidesteps. The text does not describe their fall as the corruption of innocent beings. It describes it as the betrayal of informed ones. There is no sympathy in the ancient manuscript tradition for what they chose, because the depth of the betrayal was proportional to the height of what they had been given. Early church fathers interpreted this passage, when they engaged it at all, as a warning about the danger of spiritual privilege misused. The one who has seen more is accountable for more. The one entrusted with greater understanding carries greater responsibility for what is done with it. The silence here is as significant as the words. Not one of the 200 appears in the text wrestling with the weight of what they were abandoning. Not one pauses at the threshold of that oath and measures the distance between what they were and what they were about to become. That silence is not incidental. It is the darkest detail in the entire account, because it tells us that by the time they gathered on that mountain, the decision had already been made in the secret interior of each one of them, long before the oath was spoken aloud. And their leader, Semyaza, had one remaining fear. Not God, not judgment, not the magnitude of what would be unleashed. He feared that when the moment came, he would be the only one standing there. He was not. Their names have been largely forgotten, but in the ancient manuscript tradition, they are recorded with a precision that suggests the author understood exactly what he was preserving. Not legend, not embellishment, but the specific identities of specific beings who made specific choices with specific consequences. Semyaza led them, but he did not act alone in what came next. The book of 1 Enoch, chapters 7 and 8, moves from the oath to the aftermath with a speed that feels almost cinematic, and embedded in that transition is a detail that most surface readings of the text completely miss. The Watchers did not simply descend and take wives. They descended with an agenda, a curriculum, a body of knowledge that the ancient world had never possessed, and that once released into human hands could never be recalled. The pieces begin to align when we understand that the forbidden knowledge transmitted by the Watchers was not random. It was structured, intentional. Each named leader carried a different domain of instruction, and when we lay those domains side by side, a pattern emerges that is far more disturbing than most commentators have been willing to acknowledge. Azazel, and the original language reveals something startling in the weight placed on this particular name, taught men the art of forging weapons, swords, shields, the instruments of organized violence. Before Azazel's instruction, the ancient text implies warfare at that scale did not exist in the human repertoire. What most translations miss is the implication that Azazel did not simply transfer technical knowledge. He transferred a capacity for systematized destruction that reconfigured the entire social architecture of human civilization. Hidden beneath the surface of that detail is a theological dimension that early church fathers engaged with far more seriously than modern scholarship tends to. The argument is not merely that war became possible after the Watchers descended. The argument is that a specific quality of war as organized, calculated, industrial annihilation, was introduced from outside the natural developmental arc of humanity. The original language carries echoes of something transplanted rather than evolved. But Azazel was not alone in his instruction. Other named Watchers introduced what the text categorizes with equal gravity alongside weaponry, and that juxtaposition is itself a theological statement worth sitting with. Sorcery, the reading of omens, the cutting of roots, astrology, and the interpretation of celestial movements as sources of hidden knowledge. And in what may be the most quietly devastating line in the entire passage, the text records that certain Watchers taught women the arts of beautification, cosmetics, ornamentation, the enhancement of appearance for the purposes of attraction. Pause and consider why the ancient author places that detail in the same literary category as the forging of swords. The pattern is unmistakable when we examine the full breadth of what was transmitted. Every domain of forbidden knowledge shared a common architecture. Each one represented a shortcut past dependence on God, a way of obtaining power, security, knowledge, or desirability through channels that bypassed the relationship with the Creator entirely. The sword offered security without trust. Sorcery offered knowledge without prayer. Astrology offered guidance without the voice of God. Cosmetics offered desirability without the intimacy of being known. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern in the literary structure of these chapters that most modern readers walk right past entirely. The transmission of forbidden knowledge is not presented as a series of neutral educational exchanges. It is presented as an act of contamination. The Hebrew verb structures used throughout this section carry connotations of something being poured into a vessel not designed to contain it, something introduced into a system that had no natural immunity against it. Consider the implications of watching that process unfold at ground level. A village that rose each morning to tend fields and raise children, a community whose entire frame of reference was the rhythm of planting and harvest, the stars as seasons, the voice of God as guidance, suddenly finds itself in possession of knowledge it has no moral infrastructure to steward. A young man holds a forged blade for the first time and feels something shift inside him that he has no language to describe. A woman applies what she has been taught and watches the way men look at her change, and she has no framework to process what that change costs her. This is not merely historical, it is prophetic. The typology here points directly to a recurring pattern in human experience that the New Testament picks up and carries forward without hesitation. The corrupting force is never most dangerous when it arrives through obvious violence. It is most dangerous when it arrives as knowledge, as capability, as the seductive expansion of what we can do, severed entirely from the question of what we were created to be. The spiritual dimension of what was transmitted on and around Mount Hermon was not incidental to the physical consequences that followed. The two were inseparable. What unfolded in the natural directly reflected what had already occurred in the heavenly realms, a rupture in the established order, a tearing of the membrane between what was permitted and what was not, a contamination that spread not through force, but through instruction, and the earth received it. The text does not linger in abstraction. It follows the chain of consequence with a directness that feels almost journalistic. Within the narrative arc of Enoch's account, the transmission of forbidden knowledge is not an isolated event. It is the opening movement of a catastrophe that builds with terrible momentum towards something the human world had never seen and was never designed to encounter. Because the knowledge was not the only thing the Watchers left behind, the women who received them carried something else, something that grew. Something that was born into the world with a hunger the earth itself could not satisfy. Beings of a nature and scale that had no precedent in the created order. And what those beings did to the world around them would move God to an intervention so severe, so sweeping, so final, that the memory of it was preserved in the flood traditions of nearly every ancient culture on earth. The earth had never carried anything like them before. That is not a rhetorical embellishment. That is the precise theological claim embedded in the ancient manuscript tradition, that what was born from the union of the Watchers and the daughters of men represented something genuinely unprecedented in the created order, not a variation on what already existed, not an extreme expression of natural human potential, something categorically new, something the architecture of the world had never been designed to accommodate. The Hebrew word used in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 is Nephilim, and hidden beneath the surface of that single term is a depth of meaning that most translations flatten into something almost comfortable, almost manageable. The word appears in its root form, carrying the weight of the verb nafal, to fall, to be cast down, to descend with force. Some scholars argue the term simply identifies people of great physical stature, warriors of renown, whose reputation elevated them beyond ordinary men. Others propose that the Nephilim were entirely mythological, theological metaphors invented by ancient authors to explain the presence of evil in the world without implicating God in its origins. But when we examine the evidence, neither of those readings survives contact with the full textual tradition. The original language reveals something startling, in the way the Genesis passage positions the Nephilim within the narrative arc, immediately preceding the flood. The literary structure itself reveals that their presence is not incidental. It is causal. The text does not simply note their existence and move on. It moves from the Nephilim to the grief of God in a sequence so compressed, so deliberately ordered, that the connection between the two is impossible to read as accidental. The Nephilim are not a footnote. They are the crisis that precipitates the intervention. When we cross-reference this with the book of 1 Enoch, the picture sharpens considerably. The ancient manuscript tradition does not describe the Nephilim as merely large or powerful. It describes them as beings of insatiable consumption. The text says, "They devoured everything that human labor could produce, and when that was exhausted, they turned against humanity itself. And when humanity was exhausted, they turned against one another." Pause and consider the weight of that progression. This is not the portrait of warriors who grew too proud. This is the portrait of beings whose very nature was oriented toward a kind of hunger that nothing in the created order could satisfy. The pieces begin to align when we understand why. They were, by their very constitution, beings caught between two realms, carrying within their physical form the imprint of heavenly origin, yet bound within the limitations of earthly existence. The ancient tradition suggests that this tension was not merely psychological, it was ontological. They were structured for a magnitude of experience that the material world could not provide. And that gap between what they were constituted to require and what the earth could offer expressed itself as devastation. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern in the way the Nephilim narrative is distributed across the canon that most modern readers walk right past entirely. The term does not disappear after Genesis 6. It resurfaces in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, when the Israelite spies return from Canaan and report what they encountered there. The original language carries something that most translations soften considerably. The spies do not merely say the inhabitants were large, they say that standing before them they felt like grasshoppers, and that the inhabitants perceived them the same way. The literary structure itself reveals that this is not hyperbole inserted for dramatic effect. The Septuagint translation preserves a weight in the original Greek rendering that points toward an encounter with something that fundamentally disrupted the spies' sense of their own place in the created order. What most translations miss is the theological dimension embedded in their response, that the sight of the Nephilim did not merely frighten them, it disoriented them at the level of identity. This changes everything about how we read the divine mandate for Israel to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan. Some scholars have argued that the conquest narratives represent nothing more than ancient military propaganda, stories constructed after the fact to justify territorial expansion. Others propose that the commands to utterly destroy certain populations reflect a primitive understanding of God that the New Testament subsequently corrected. But when we examine the evidence through the lens of the Nephilim tradition, a third reading emerges, one that the early church fathers engaged with far more seriously than contemporary scholarship tends to acknowledge. Hidden beneath the surface of those conquest narratives is a thread of cosmic continuation. The flood had not ended the Nephilim problem, it had interrupted it. The Watchers were bound, we will explore the full dimensions of that binding, but the lineages they had corrupted did not vanish from the earth entirely. The ancient manuscript traditions, both within the canonical text and in the surrounding literature of Second Temple Judaism, preserve a consistent pattern. That pockets of that original corruption persisted, concentrated in specific geographic regions, and that the divine mandate to Israel was not merely territorial, but cosmological. The pattern is unmistakable when we examine the specific populations named in the conquest texts: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. Each name carries within it, in the original language, connotations that point away from ordinary human variation and toward something the ancient world consistently categorized in a separate register entirely. Consider the implications of that for a moment. The military campaigns of Joshua are not in this reading simply about land. They are about the continuation of a divine intervention that the flood began. the systematic dismantling of a corrupted lineage that had entrenched itself across the ancient Near East. This is not merely historical, it is prophetic. The typology here points to a dimension of spiritual conflict that Paul picks up directly in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, when he tells the early church that their struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in the heavenly realms. The ancient pattern does not stay in the ancient world. It echoes forward. The form of the conflict changes. The nature of it does not. But all of this, the Nephilim, the corruption, the conquest, the cosmic continuation, exists downstream of a single moment, a single night on a mountain where 200 beings sealed an oath and began their descent. The question the text forces us to sit with is not simply what happened. The question is, what was God's direct response to it? Not just the flood, not just the conquest, but the response aimed specifically at the watchers themselves. The judgment handed down not in the natural realm, but in the heavenly one. Because embedded in the letters of Peter and Jude, written thousands of years after Enoch, preserved in the New Testament canon, read in every Christian tradition on earth, is a reference so precise, so specific, that it cannot be read as anything other than a direct confirmation of what the ancient manuscripts described. The watchers were judged, they were bound, and the prison that holds them, according to the apostolic witness itself, is not a metaphor. It still holds them now. There is a man standing at the edge of the ancient world, holding a message he never asked to carry. His name is Enoch, and what the text reveals about his role in this story is one of the most quietly astonishing dimensions of the entire Watcher narrative, one that most teaching on this subject steps past without pausing to consider what it actually means. The book of 1 Enoch, chapters 12 through 16, records something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the ancient manuscript tradition. The Watchers, beings of a nature and consciousness so far beyond the human scale that the comparison strains language, sought out a human intercessor, not because they were required to, not because God demanded it, but because they could not bring themselves to stand before the throne directly and speak their own petition. Pause and consider what that reveals about the weight of what they had done. These were beings who had stood in the presence of God, beings whose original assignment placed them at the intersection of the heavenly and earthly realms, beings who, by virtue of their nature and their position, possessed a clarity of spiritual perception that no human being on this side of eternity has ever fully accessed. And yet, in the aftermath of their rebellion, in the full awareness of what they had set in motion, they were not able to approach God themselves. They asked Enoch to go for them. The original language reveals something startling in the way this commission is described. The verb used for what Enoch does is not the ordinary vocabulary of prophetic speech. It carries within it the weight of formal legal representation, the language of someone standing in the gap between a petitioner and a judge, not merely delivering a message, but embodying the act of intercession itself. Hidden beneath the surface of this passage is a theological inversion so precise that it could not be accidental. The beings who abandoned their post to descend to the realm of humanity now required a human being to ascend on their behalf. The pieces begin to align when we understand what this inversion signifies. The Watchers had violated the established order, the God-designed hierarchy of the created cosmos. And in the aftermath of that violation, the order reasserted itself in a form they could not have anticipated. The creature they had corrupted became the only available channel through which their petition could travel. Enoch ascends. He stands before the throne. He delivers the petition. And the response he carries back is not what they hoped for. The text records the divine verdict with a precision and a weight that the literary structure itself amplifies through deliberate compression. The answer is not anger. It is not rage in the sense of emotion uncontrolled. What the ancient manuscript tradition conveys is something far more sobering, the measured, unalterable pronouncement of a judge who has seen everything, who requires no additional evidence, and who speaks from a place of absolute moral clarity. There will be no peace for them, no forgiveness, no restoration of what they abandoned. What most translations miss is the specific theological vocabulary embedded in that verdict. The Hebrew and Aramaic language used to describe the absence of peace for the watchers is not simply the language of punishment, it is the language of permanent severance. The ancient word carries connotations not merely of consequence, but of categorical finality. The closing of a door that once closed admits no further negotiation. The judgment that follows is described across two parallel streams of ancient tradition, the Enochian manuscripts and the canonical New Testament letters, with a consistency that demands attention. When Peter writes in his second letter, chapter 2, verse 4, that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into chains of darkness to be held for judgment, the original Greek term he uses is Tartarus, a word that in the broader ancient world carried specific connotations of a subterranean prison of profound depth, reserved for beings whose offenses placed them in a category beyond ordinary punishment. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern in the way Peter's language maps onto the Enochian tradition, with a precision that goes far beyond general thematic similarity. The specific elements, the chains, the darkness, the holding in reserve for a final judgment, appear in both traditions in the same sequence, with the same theological weight, pointing toward a shared source of understanding that the early church clearly possessed, and that was gradually lost from mainstream theological conversation over the following centuries. The literary structure itself reveals something that most surface readings of these New Testament passages completely miss. Jude, in verses 6 and 7 of his letter, places the binding of the watchers in direct literary parallel with the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, not as a casual pairing of examples, but as a deliberately constructed theological argument about the nature of boundaries violated and the permanence of consequences that follow. The silence here is as significant as the words. Jude does not explain the watcher tradition to his readers. He assumes they already know it. He assumes it is part of the shared theological vocabulary of the early church, accessible, recognized, and authoritative. This changes everything about how we read the margins of the New Testament canon. The flood itself, as catastrophic and total as it was, is presented in the ancient tradition not as the primary judgment of the watchers, but as the consequence of their corruption extended to the created order they had contaminated. The flood addressed the earth. The binding addressed the watchers themselves. These were two distinct acts of divine response, aimed at two distinct dimensions of the same crisis. Consider the implications of that distinction carefully. The earth was cleansed through water. The watchers were removed through binding, and embedded in that parallel structure is a theological statement about the nature of spiritual judgment that the New Testament carries forward with remarkable consistency. The book of Revelation, chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, describes the binding of the ancient serpent in language that echoes the Enochian tradition with unmistakable precision. Chains, a pit, a seal, a duration appointed, and a final release before the ultimate judgment. The typology here points to a cosmic architecture of divine justice that operates across vast spans of time, with patient, inexorable movement toward a conclusion that was determined before the first stone of Mount Hermon was ever set in place. This is not merely historical, it is prophetic. What unfolds in the natural reflects what is happening in the heavenly realms, and what was sealed in those realms at the time of the flood has not been unsealed. The prison that holds the watchers is not a metaphor constructed for theological comfort. The apostolic witness of both Peter and Jude treats it as present, ongoing, and literal. They are still there. But here is the dimension of this story that most teachers never arrive at. The thread that runs from Mount Hermon at the moment of the pact, through the flood, through the binding, through the conquest narratives, through the apostolic letters, and emerges in the New Testament at a location so specific, so geographically and theologically precise, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The same mountain where the watchers sealed their oath, the mountain whose very name encodes the word for curse and destruction, the threshold where 200 beings swore to corrupt the created order, that mountain appears again in the gospel accounts, not as a backdrop, not as incidental geography, as the chosen location of one of the most theologically dense moments in the entire ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And what happens on that mountain, what is declared there in that specific place over that specific ground, is not simply a moment of divine beauty. It is a direct, deliberate, unmistakable act of cosmic reclamation. A statement addressed not to the disciples standing there in astonishment, but to every principality and power that had ever claimed that mountain as their own. The same ground where darkness made its covenant becomes the ground where the Son of God is transfigured in blinding light. That is not coincidence. That is not geography. That is the answer. There is a moment in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 through 9, that most believers read as a scene of divine beauty and leave it there. The light, the cloud, the voice. Moses and Elijah appearing alongside Jesus in radiant conversation. Peter stumbling over his words, overwhelmed by what his eyes cannot fully process. It is beautiful. It is overwhelming. It is also something else entirely. Hidden beneath the surface of this passage is a dimension that most translations never surface. A layer of geographical and theological precision that, once seen, reframes the entire event as something far more deliberate, far more directed, and far more cosmically significant than a moment of heavenly glory witnessed by 3 astonished disciples. The question we must ask ourselves is not simply what happened on the mountain of transfiguration. The question is, which mountain? Matthew's account does not name it directly, but the ancient manuscript tradition, cross-referenced with the geographic details embedded in the surrounding narrative, points with remarkable consistency toward a location that would have carried immediate and unmistakable weight for any reader, steeped in the Hebrew textual tradition. The literary structure itself reveals that Jesus and his disciples had been traveling in the region of Caesarea Philippi, a territory situated at the southern base of a mountain whose peak rose into cloud and whose name encoded in the original language the vocabulary of curse and destruction. Mount Hermon, the same mountain where 200 beings swore their covenant of rebellion. The same threshold where the Watchers descended into the human realm with an agenda of corruption that fractured the ancient world at its foundations. The same ground that the ancient tradition had saturated with the weight of cherem, the Hebrew designation for something set apart under divine judgment, and Jesus chose it, not by accident, not by convenience of geography. He chose it with the full theological awareness that every step of his ministry demonstrates. The awareness of a being who understood not merely the surface of the created order, but the entire invisible architecture beneath it. The pieces begin to align when we understand that every significant moment in the Gospel accounts carries within it a deliberate relationship to the ancient story it is answering. This is not merely historical, it is prophetic. The typology here is precise beyond any reasonable attribution to coincidence. The Watchers descended on Mount Hermon to corrupt the created order. Jesus ascended Mount Hermon to declare its reclamation. The same ground that witnessed the most catastrophic act of collective rebellion in the ancient world became the ground where the Son of God stood in blinding, transfigured light, flanked by Moses and Elijah, the 2 figures who in the Hebrew tradition represented the law and the prophets, and was declared by the voice of the Father himself to be the beloved Son in whom all divine pleasure rests. Pause and consider what that declaration meant to every principality and power that had ever claimed that mountain as their own. This was not a gentle moment of spiritual encouragement offered to 3 tired disciples. This was a proclamation, a cosmic territorial declaration addressed to the unseen realm, to every dark covenant ever sealed on that ground, to every claim ever staked by beings who descended in rebellion to that very threshold. The voice that spoke over the waters at creation spoke again over the mountain of the Watchers' pact, and what it said was not a question. It was a verdict. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern in the way the Transfiguration narrative is positioned within the Gospel of Matthew that most surface readings completely miss. It occurs immediately after Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, the moment where Jesus asks his disciples who they believe him to be. And Peter answers with the declaration that echoes through the entire New Testament, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds by saying that on this rock he will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The original language reveals something startling in that phrase. The Greek word translated as hell in most English versions is not the ordinary word for the place of the dead. It is Hades, and in the broader ancient world, That term carried specific connotations of the realm of the bound, the imprisoned, the chained in darkness. What most translations miss is the geographical and theological precision of what Jesus was saying in that moment. He was not making a general promise about spiritual resilience. He was standing at the foot of the mountain where the watchers made their pact, the mountain of Cherem, the mountain of the curse, and declaring that the gates of the prison itself could not contain what he was building. Let that truth sink in. The binding of the watchers, the chains of darkness, the pit reserved for the final judgment, all of it present in the geography, in the ancient tradition, in the invisible architecture of that specific location. And Jesus stands there and says, "Not one gate holds against what I am establishing." The spiritual dimension of this event extends far beyond its historical moment. What unfolds in the natural reflects what is happening in the heavenly realms. And what was happening in the heavenly realms on that mountain, in that transfigured moment, was the formal announcement of a victory whose full dimensions the disciples would not understand until they stood at an empty tomb on the other side of the cross. This changes everything about how we read the remainder of the New Testament. When Paul writes in Colossians chapter 2 verse 15 that through the cross Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them and triumphing over them, the original language carries the imagery of a Roman general leading captives through the streets of Rome in a triumph procession, publicly displaying the defeat of every enemy. What most translations flatten is the cosmic scope of what Paul is describing. This was not merely a spiritual transaction between a holy God and a sinful humanity. This was the final movement of a war that began on a mountain, was answered by a flood, echoed through the conquest of Canaan, was preserved in the letters of Peter and Jude, and was resolved once and for all on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem. The pattern is unmistakable when we examine the full arc of what Scripture preserves from Genesis to Revelation. Every dark covenant has an answer. Every corrupted threshold has a reclamation. Every act of collective rebellion in the unseen realm has a corresponding act of divine sovereignty that does not merely undo the damage. It transforms the very site of the damage into a declaration of glory. The same ground where darkness swore its oath becomes the ground where light is transfigured. And what this means for those of us living in the echo of all of it, in a world still shaped by the spiritual forces these ancient events unleashed, is not abstract. It is immediate. It is personal. It is the difference between a faith that trembles at the weight of the unseen world and a faith that stands within that weight, rooted, immovable, anchored in the one whose voice spoke over every mountain and whose light shattered every darkness. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 13 says this, "Therefore put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Not to win a battle, you were never equipped to fight alone. Not to unravel every mystery of the unseen realm through human scholarship or spiritual ambition, but to stand, grounded in the Word of God, anchored in the identity declared over you by the same voice that declared the Son's identity on that mountain, clothed in truth, in righteousness, in the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace, standing on ground that has already been reclaimed." The watchers swore an oath on a mountain and believed it changed the order of things. They were right. It did. But the final word over that mountain was not spoken by 200 beings descending in rebellion. It was spoken by a Father declaring his Son, in blinding light, in the full presence of the law and the prophets, over the very ground where darkness had made its covenant. And that word has never been revoked. Stand on it. Build your life on it. When the unseen world presses against the edges of what you understand, when the weight of powers and principalities feels more real than the promises you are standing on, return to the Word. Not as a ritual, not as a formality, as the living, active, sharper than any sword declaration of the one who reclaimed every mountain, answered every covenant, and left an empty tomb as the final evidence that no darkness, no matter how ancient, no matter how organized, no matter how many swore the oath, has the final word. He does. If this journey through the ancient layers of Scripture has moved something in you, if you have never taken the step of surrendering your life to the one whose voice shattered the darkness on that mountain, this is your moment. Not tomorrow. Right now. If you are ready to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, as the one who reclaimed every corrupted ground and offers you a place in his unshakable kingdom, type these words in the comments below. I accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior of my life. And if this video opened something in you, if it reshaped the way you read Scripture and understand the unseen world, hit that like button right now, leave a comment telling us what struck you most, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another layer of revelation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the Word of God has depths that most people will never encounter, and you were brought here today for a reason.